February 1943. A captured American tank stands under the gray sky of Germany. The engineers expected a crude machine, heavy, clumsy, built by amateurs. But when they opened the engine bay, silence filled the room. Everything they believed about engineering was wrong. The machine before them wasn't elegant. It wasn't beautiful, but it was perfect, and that terrified them. February 1943, Tunisia. The desert had fallen silent, not in peace but in exhaustion. Across miles of scorched sand, the remnants of the American 1st Armored Division withdrew under the weight of German counterattacks. And there, among the wrecks, the Germans found something unexpected. A machine that refused to die. The M4 Sherman, serial number USA 3067641, stood half buried in dust, its paint scorched by fire, but its engine intact. The soldiers who approached it expected another crude American tank, a product of mass production, not craftsmanship. A tin box, as the propaganda films called it. But as they inspected the hull, the welds, the suspension, the smooth, unbroken gearing on the tracks, something didn't fit the narrative. The tank had taken direct hits. It had thrown a track and kept going, and even now, its hatches could still open with ease. The German field engineers radioed back to headquarters. Ein brauchbares Exemplar erbeutet. A usable specimen captured. The order came within hours. Send it to Kummersdorf, Germany's top testing ground. There the tank would face a new kind of battle. Not of guns, but of gears. Not of armor, but of engineering truth. As the desert wind buried the tracks of war, no one yet realized that this single captured machine would expose a secret deeper than tactics, a flaw in the very soul of German industry. The journey began on the coast of North Africa. Under the burning sun of Tunisia, a captured tank was winched onto a German flatbed trailer, its olive drab paint now streaked with sand and oil. The soldiers who guarded it joked quietly. They called it Der Bauernpanzer, the farmer's tank. Too simple, too ugly, too American. But for the engineers who waited in Germany, this machine was far more than a trophy. It was a mystery that demanded to be solved. Through ports at Palermo and Naples, across the Alps and into the heart of Europe, the Sherman traveled by rail, a silent passenger through a continent still burning. At every station, curious officers came to see it. Some nodded with polite interest, others smirked, convinced it would confirm what they already believed, that the German way of engineering was the pinnacle of modern science, and everything else was imitation. But among them were a few who saw something different. The tracks were evenly worn. The suspension system, clean, logical, symmetrical. The welds, consistent, machine perfect. No rough edges, no improvisation. By the time the flat car rolled into Kummersdorf, the laughter had faded. Now there was only curiosity and a quiet sense of unease. This proving ground, hidden deep in the forests south of Berlin, was the beating heart of German military research, where rockets, tanks, and secret weapons of the Reich were tested under absolute precision. The Sherman arrived like a foreign language, one that the best minds of Germany thought they could translate easily. But as they began to disassemble it, piece by piece, the translation would begin to fail. What they would find inside was not just a different design philosophy. It was an entirely different worldview. A machine built not to impress, but to endure. Not to dominate, but to survive. And survival, as the war was about to prove, was the only kind of victory that mattered. March 1943. The captured Sherman arrived at the Kummersdorf proving grounds under a low gray sky. Inside a hangar marked Versuchsgelände 2, Germany's top engineers gathered for the inspection. The air smelled of oil, dust, and cold metal. This was where the future of warfare was supposed to be written, and now that future stood on American tracks. At first, there was confidence. They measured, photographed, and documented everything with surgical precision. To them, this was routine. Another foreign design to be dissected. Another example of industrial inferiority. But as the hours passed, confidence turned to confusion. The suspension, fully lubricated. The wiring, color-coded and accessible. The gearbox, clean, balanced, and astonishingly simple. Every piece fit perfectly, without hand fitting or adjustment. One engineer whispered, "Es ist wie ein Automobil." It's like a car. That was not a compliment. It was disbelief. In German engineering philosophy, complexity was synonymous with excellence. Every Panther, every Tiger was a masterpiece of precision, and a nightmare to maintain. They were built to impress officers, not to serve mechanics. But the Sherman was different. It had no elegance, no vanity, only purpose. They turned the crank handle once. The engine started on the first try. Hours later, it was still running, smoothly, reliably, without a single leak. The lead engineer noted in his report, "Überraschend einfach." Überraschend haltbar, surprisingly simple. Surprisingly durable. That single line, buried in the test documents, was more than observation. It was quiet heresy. Because what they found inside this machine was not just the result of American engineering. It was the proof of an industrial philosophy Germany had already lost sight of. Here, in this dimly lit hall, the myth of mechanical superiority was beginning to crack, and no amount of armor could protect it. April 1943, Kummersdorf. The tests had begun. The captured Sherman was now stripped, measured, and prepared for the most crucial examination, its transmission. The German engineers expected failure. They always did. Every machine, no matter how advanced, broke down under strain. That was simply how mechanics worked, or so they believed. But as the test rig hummed to life, the Sherman's gearbox began to turn, smoothly, rhythmically, endlessly. Minutes became hours. Hours became days. The gears refused to wear down. The secret lay in their design. Herringbone cut gears, hardened steel, mass-produced with microscopic precision across thousands of American factories. They didn't grind. They didn't heat. They meshed like clockwork. A Panther transmission could fail after just 150 kilometers of real combat. A Tiger's after 100. The Sherman, it ran for thousands, without complaint. The engineers took notes, frowning in silence. One of them murmured, "Das ist nicht Kriegstechnik. Das ist Ziviltechnik. This isn't war engineering. This is civilian engineering." He meant it as an insult, but he was right. What Germany called civilian, mass-produced, standardized, repairable, was exactly what made America unstoppable. In the Reich, excellence meant craftsmanship. In America, excellence meant consistency. Here in this small German laboratory, the two definitions collided, and one of them shattered. By the third week of testing, they increased the load, doubled the pressure, ran the gearbox under conditions no tank would ever endure. Still, it turned. The official report described it coldly. Kein signifikanter Verschleiß festgestellt. No significant wear observed. But between the lines, there was something deeper. An unspoken admission that the war of ideas was already lost, because every revolution per minute was a reminder that reliability, not brilliance, wins wars. By summer 1943, the engineers at Kummersdorf were ready for the next test. Firepower. On paper, Germany had already won that contest. The Tiger's 88mm gun could pierce armor at 2 kilometers. The Panther's 75mm cannon could shatter a Sherman before the Americans even saw it. The Sherman's gun, by comparison, looked almost childish. A 75mm cannon with modest penetration and low muzzle velocity. The German officers smiled. The Americans, they thought, had built a toy. But when the firing trials began, the laughter faded once again. The Sherman's turret rotated faster, its sights aligned quicker, its recoil system reset in seconds. While the Tiger roared with power, the Sherman whispered with efficiency. Between shots, German crews spent minutes recalibrating, waiting for hydraulic pressure to stabilize, cleaning recoil systems clogged with carbon. The American guns simply kept firing. Each system had been designed not for perfection but for performance, and there was a difference. The Tiger could dominate for a moment. The Sherman could fight all day. When the engineers recorded the data, the numbers told a quiet truth. German firepower destroyed tanks. American engineering won wars. One senior officer, after observing the tests, reportedly muttered under his breath, "Wenn Perfektion stirbt, gewinnt Einfachheit." When perfection dies, simplicity wins. In Berlin, that phrase would have been considered defeatist. But here, surrounded by broken transmissions and burned-out engines, it sounded like prophecy. The more they studied the Sherman, the more it revealed the secret that Germany could not imitate. Not steel, not armor, not range. Reliability. A Tiger might destroy 5 Shermans in one battle, but 10 more would arrive the next morning, and only one Tiger might still be running. The engineers began to understand what the generals refused to admit. The war wasn't about who had the strongest machine. It was about who had machines that worked. And as one German mechanic later said, years after the war, you could hear the Tiger's power and the Sherman's persistence. And persistence always wins. By 1944, the German war machine had begun to break down, not from battle, but from within. At depots across France, Poland, and the Eastern Front, rows of Panthers and Tigers sat silent. Not destroyed, not captured, just broken. Their engines overheated, transmissions locked, final drives shattered under their own weight. The numbers told the story better than any propaganda could. In January 1944, the Wehrmacht recorded over 500 defective Panzer IV final drives, 370 defective Panther transmissions, and more than 100 Tiger breakdowns. Tanks abandoned in mud or snow, not by enemy fire, but by their own engineering. Kummersdorf's engineers compiled report after report, each one colder than the last. Erhöhte Ausfallrate. Ersatzteile nicht verfügbar, increased failure rate. Spare parts unavailable, factories could not keep up. Each Tiger took 300,000 man-hours to build, 3 times that of a Sherman. Every replacement gearbox required precision machining by craftsmen who were now at the front or dead. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, visited Hillersleben in June 1943 and saw the captured Sherman demonstration. Afterward, he confided to an aide, "Der Amerikaner baut keine Kunstwerke. Baut Werkzeuge, die funktionieren. The American does not build artworks. He builds tools that work." That single line would echo through history. The Tiger and Panther were indeed masterpieces, but they were fragile masterpieces, built for pride, not for pressure. Each one was a sculpture with an engine, and sculptures do not win wars. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Detroit's assembly lines were producing 2,000 Shermans a month. They did not require genius, only gasoline and spare parts. When one failed, another rolled out of the factory the same week. On the Eastern Front, German tank crews had a phrase: "Lieber ein amerikanischer Feind als ein deutscher Motor." Better an American enemy than a German engine. Behind that dark humor lay exhaustion. An entire army slowly learning that victory requires more than brilliance. It requires endurance. The engineers at Kummersdorf could calculate every stress, every torque value, every fracture angle. But they could not calculate the weight of arrogance. In 1944, the war was no longer about tanks. It was about time. And time like the Sherman, was running only in one direction. Berlin, November 1944. The war was already lost, but no one dared to say it aloud. In the Ministry of Armaments, Albert Speer sat surrounded by numbers that no longer obeyed his will. Production quotas, steel allocations, repair statistics, all told the same story. Machines that couldn't be repaired, factories that couldn't be rebuilt, a nation trying to fight an industrial war with pre-industrial pride. On his desk lay a folder marked Kummersdorf Evaluation M4A2 Sherman. He flipped through the pages in silence. Durability tests, transmission reports, engine analyses. Every line described what Germany no longer had: resources, manpower, time. The engineers had written without emotion. Transmission lifespan 3,200 kilometers. Engine maintenance interval 500 hours. Operational readiness 87%. Speer closed the folder and said quietly, "This is not engineering. This is production philosophy." His deputy frowned. Speer continued, "The Americans don't win because their tanks are better. They win because their factories believe in repetition. We still believe in perfection." He walked to the map on the wall, red pins for Allied factories, blue pins for German ones. By 1944, the map looked like a confession. "They build 49,000 Shermans," he whispered. "We build 6,000 Tigers, and half of them never reach the front." Silence filled the room. Outside, Berlin shook from distant bombing. Inside, a man who once believed in total war finally understood the totality of defeat. Not defeat by guns, defeat by efficiency. In his memoirs decades later, Speer would write, "When I saw the Sherman report, I knew we had lost. The war was not decided by courage or genius, but by a wrench that fit every bolt. It was the moment Germany's most powerful engineer realized he hadn't lost to America's army. He'd lost to America's system. The war for Europe was not decided on the battlefield. It was decided here, in the noise of machines. In 1944, while Tiger tanks rolled out of German workshops one by one, America's assembly lines thundered like mechanical armies. At Ford's River Rouge plant in Michigan, a new Sherman tank rolled off the line every 5 minutes. Engines, transmissions, armor plates, all forged in automated harmony. Across the Atlantic in Germany, each Tiger required over 300,000 man-hours to complete. No two were identical. Every gearbox demanded a craftsman. Every repair required article. And art does not win industrial wars. The Americans had mastered something Germany had dismissed as crude: standardization. Every Sherman part fit every Sherman tank. Every wrench turned every bolt. No delay. No waiting for custom adjustments. In Germany, even the finest Tiger crew might wait days for a replacement gear. A Sherman mechanic could repair a tank in hours. The German engineers at Kummersdorf began calling the American system Massenintelligenz, mass intelligence. Not genius from one man, but intelligence multiplied by thousands of hands. For every Panther that left a German factory, 5 Shermans crossed the Atlantic. For every hour Germany spent fixing, America spent moving forward. The numbers were merciless. 49,324 Shermans built. 6,000 Tigers and Panthers combined. And yet it wasn't the quantity alone. It was the predictability. A Tiger could fight brilliantly once, then fail catastrophically. A Sherman could fight reliably 100 times. The difference was philosophy. The Germans engineered for glory. The Americans engineered for continuity. And continuity in war is victory. Years later, one German factory director would confess, "We built masterpieces for parades." They built machines for soldiers. That was the true factory war, a silent duel of philosophies. Steel against system, artistry against automation, and as the sound of American production drowned out the silence of German shortages, the outcome became inevitable. The Allies didn't just outnumber Germany. They outproduced it. They outrepaired it. They outlasted it. And by 1945, the mightiest war machine on Earth was being defeated by machines that simply worked. Winter 1944. Somewhere east of Bastogne, the tank war had become a war of engines. German crews huddled under tarps, fighting not the enemy, but their own machines. Oil froze inside transmission housings. Hydraulic lines cracked like bones. In the distance, Shermans roared to life, rough, loud, imperfect, but alive. For the men inside the Tigers and Panthers, the battle now began before the first shot. Against cold, against failure, against exhaustion. A Panther transmission might last 150 kilometers, if the crew was lucky. A Sherman could drive 5 times that before its first major repair. The difference was not courage, it was design. American mechanics carried spare parts in crates. German ones carried notebooks and prayers. Captured reports from Kummersdorf showed it in numbers. Panther, 36% operational readiness. Sherman, 82%. That gap, invisible on maps, decided entire campaigns. At the Battle of the Bulge, the Wehrmacht lost over 400 tanks, less than half to combat. The rest simply stopped moving. Meanwhile, American columns advanced, replacing engines in the field, swapping transmissions under canvas tents, drinking coffee beside tanks that would fight again within hours. A German mechanic later said, "Our tanks were lions. Theirs were mules. The lion dies beautifully. The mule keeps working." As the front line shifted west, the reality became undeniable. The Sherman didn't have to be invincible. It just had to be available. Every time a Panther broke down, somewhere a Sherman replaced it. Every kilometer the American tank advanced was a kilometer that German machinery could not endure. That was the true battle of maintenance, not fought by gunners or generals, but by grease, by discipline, and by the humble genius of simplicity. By 1942, when American engineers began designing what would become the M4 Sherman, they were not trying to build the best tank. They were trying to build the right one. To the untrained eye, the Sherman looked unremarkable. Medium armor, average gun, rounded hull. But to the men at Chrysler and Fisher Body, it represented something far more powerful than firepower: philosophy. They designed for maintenance, for mass production, for movement. If a tank could be repaired in hours, if its parts could be replaced in any field workshop, if it could travel 1,000 miles without failure, then it didn't need to be invincible. It needed to be reliable. German designers scoffed. To them, a tank was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, a cathedral of steel precision. But cathedrals take years to build, and wars do not wait for perfection. The Sherman was born from a different mindset, the American automotive soul. The same engineers who built Buicks, Chevrolets, and Fords applied their logic to war. A tank, like a car, must serve its user, not intimidate him. They standardized every bolt, every bracket, every fitting. Engines could be swapped in hours. Gearboxes replaced without removing armor. Hydraulics simplified. Electrical systems color-coded. The result? A machine that every mechanic could understand, every crew could trust, and every army could sustain. German reports captured the secret. The American tank does not impress until it never stops working. This was not mediocrity. It was mastery of priorities. Where the Germans built for pride, the Americans built for persistence. In an age obsessed with perfection, the Sherman was a triumph of imperfection used wisely. Its armor could be pierced. Its gun could be outmatched. But its idea, that engineering should serve logistics, was untouchable. That idea won the war long before the Allies reached Berlin. A U.S. Army engineer once said, "The Sherman was never the best tank on the field." But it was always on the field, and that made all the difference. The Germans built Tigers to impress posterity. America built Shermans to win Tuesday. Kummersdorf. Proving Grounds. February 1944. The snow outside was gray from soot. Inside the test hall, the air smelled of fuel and disbelief. For months, the engineers had waited for this moment, a chance to dissect the enemy's pride. The captured Sherman, serial number 3067641, stood silent beneath the lights. The Germans called it War Daddy 2. At first glance, it looked crude. Welds too thick, bolts too large, hull edges unfinished. But as the disassembly began, their confidence began to dissolve. The transmission came apart cleanly. A perfect herringbone gear set. No burrs, no fractures. A design so robust that it could run thousands of kilometers without precision tuning. By comparison, the Panther's transmission lasted barely 150 hours. One engineer ran his hand along the Sherman's gearbox casing and muttered, "Es ist überdimensioniert." It's overbuilt. The room fell silent. They all understood what that meant. Overbuilt didn't mean sloppy. It meant forgiving. It meant human. It meant that this machine had been designed for a soldier, not for a showroom. As they inspected deeper, they found more revelations. Electrical connectors labeled in plain English. Fuel lines accessible by hand. Gearbox brackets doubled for reinforcement. Every part screamed the same truth. This was a machine meant to survive mistakes. In the back of the room, a senior officer from Berlin watched without expression. He finally spoke. "Gentlemen, they design for workers. We design for engineers, and we no longer have engineers silence again." The test continued for days. Engines run, treads replaced, pressure readings taken. Nothing failed, not once. When the final report was typed, its words were quiet but devastating. No critical weaknesses found. Design optimized for serviceability. Operational efficiency exceeds expectation. The conclusion at the bottom carried only one sentence. The enemy's strength lies not in invention, but in repetition. For the men at Kummersdorf, it was more than a technical admission. It was the moment they realized Germany had built perfection into extinction, and America had built imperfection into victory.